Hey, welcome guys. We'll get started here in just a minute. I've got a question that I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to actually share a personal story too. So we will have both going on today. All right. So this is kind of a follow-up question from last week. So there's some overlap with this, but I'll try to get a little more in depth with it. This is a big topic regarding kind of the traits of a narcissist, and kind of specifically maybe like how they're different from other abusive individuals. Let's see, what are some of the specific characteristics of narcissistic abuse that cause us to find ourselves stuck now and needing to redefine ourselves? So how does that relate to our identity? In what ways is that similar to other types of abuse or trauma? And then specific to art therapy, like how is that related? The connection between what comes out in our art. So often I don't, part of the question was, kind of saying, I might have addressed this in earlier coaching videos, but I haven't, with the exception of last week, touching on it some, because I really don't talk much about narcissism in this program, because my emphasis is on us, us moving forward. But I do think that this is an important topic as far as kind of understanding what's going on with us. Like, why are we struggling so much with our sense of self? Why are we feeling stuck? So I understand the purpose of the question in that context, and I think it's important to address. So So first of all, let's see how to start this. And then I'm also going to share, I'm going to share something personal that I hope is encouraging at the end of this. I like to share kind of my own artwork and my own process as I journey right along with you in my healing. So first I want to explain, so kind of what makes a narcissist. I think that's a good foundation. So there's kind of two thoughts here about, like, two different ways that someone can develop narcissistic traits, whether that's extreme to the point of like having a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, or someone who just has some of those characteristics. I think this is clearly one of the most underdiagnosed mental illnesses, or it's technically considered a personality disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. Or I believe, gosh, I don't want to speak incorrectly. I'm not as familiar with the DSM-5, the current one, because I prefer not to deal with diagnoses as of late. So I could be wrong, but at least it was a personality disorder. And so two different kind of ways people tend to develop these traits. One, and I think what is most common, is that person experienced severe trauma in childhood. And so that has literally altered their brain, and specifically altered how they relate to others. There's been some like relational trauma there. So meaning abuse, right? So it's not just that they, I don't want to say just, like minimizing it, but something like being in a car accident or a natural disaster, or being, chronically ill as a child. Those are all childhood traumas. But what I'm referring to is abuse by a parent or caregiver, to where that developmentally affected that child, who's now grown into an adult narcissist, affected that child's ability to experience empathy, their deep sense of shame that they have, which I'll touch on more in a minute. Their lack of identity, where they find their identity in their achievements or in their relationships, that kind of thing. And so I'll get more into that. That's more what I'm going to focus on. One other way that someone can develop these narcissistic traits is if in their home growing up, they basically they as the child were put on such a pedestal to where they were like never told no. They really ran the household, they ran the family. And this is much more than just a spoiled child, okay? This is a situation where the parents like literally never said no. The child really was in charge. They were totally catered to, and so, I would argue that that's a form of emotional abuse, of trauma for that child. And definitely my guess is that a parent who is relating to their child in that way, that parent has their own childhood trauma, childhood abuse that they have not healed. Because you know, I mean, I think as parents, like anyone who's a parent in this group, we've all had those moments maybe where we're like, you know, am I being too harsh or am I being too lenient with my child? We can go back and forth and kind of question, but for someone to develop these narcissistic traits, it is really extreme. And, you know, throughout their childhood, like they did not experience being told no. They have that sense of entitlement and the arrogance, and everyone should always follow what they say. Okay. I think what's more common is what I mentioned first, that person has experienced abuse as a child. They had severe childhood abuse. So, and I mentioned the sense of shame. So this is where it gets to how they relate to us and how we lose our identity. So if they were abused and taught that they were always wrong and guilty and everything was their fault, right? If that's, and we're talking like, emotional abuse here, right? I don't even specify like physical or sexual abuse, because I think it's a given if those forms of abuse are there, or verbal abuse, that emotional abuse is present. And it's really the emotional aspect of it that damages us as we grow, whether it's childhood trauma or you know, domestic abuse, intimate partner trauma, abuse. It's the emotional piece of it that is the most lasting effect. Even with sexual abuse and physical abuse, you may be physically injured, but it's the emotional aspect of that, right? When someone is sexually abused, that's the part that stays with you, not the physical trauma. And so a child who is made to feel shame and like they are always wrong, they are never right, they are put inappropriately in a position of having to care for their parents. We're talking severe abuse, okay, which could include physical, sexual abuse, but definitely that emotional abuse is present at a high level. And again, those parents doing that are those who have their own unhealed trauma. So that person, that kid, who we can have compassion for the narcissist in our life, who maybe dealt with that as a child, for sure. We can have compassion for the little boy version of them, the little girl version of them. But you know, as an adult, they're responsible for their actions, right? And it's very unlikely for someone with these traits to seek out therapy because they think they're always right. But so when they're in this relationship with you, they can't. I'm losing my train of thought. I've got so many things going on in my mind right now. Let me give an example that a client brought up the other day, because I think this is a good example. So it's of a narcissist father and a young daughter, like a 6-year-old little girl, right? And she pointed out a mess that the father had made, just because kids point that stuff out, right? She wasn't being mean, but why did you do this, Daddy? And he couldn't accept that he had made that mess, because that would reflect negatively on him. So much so he couldn't accept that, so much so that he then lied and basically tried to convince the little girl that she had actually made the mess. No, I didn't do that. You did that, right? And went into an explanation of like how it was possible that she actually made the mess, like that's really extreme. If someone, their sense of self is so fragile that they can't just accept a little kid making a comment like that, again, not even in a mean way, and say, oh, like that's normal. Like I spilled a little water when I was pouring your water earlier, like whatever it is. So they really can't accept any indication that there is any flaw in them. And it goes back to that sense of shame that was instilled in them as a child. So they believe that any flaw brings back this subconscious wave of that shame that they can't face in themselves, because facing it would mean going back to all that childhood stuff. Okay. So I'm not explaining this very well. I feel like I went into, I don't remember what all I mentioned last week, but so it's, in my experience working with clients and, in my own situation and stuff I've read, but largely in my experience, I think it all comes back to that sense of shame and that need to avoid it at all costs. And this is all subconscious. And I'm going to get into that when I talk about kind of our role again, which I touched on last time. These are subconscious dynamics. This has been programmed in this person from childhood. If they've experienced that abuse, they've been shamed for just being human, and these are the same things they do to us, right? Told that we're always wrong, like that we're just like worth nothing. Always these unattainable expectations that are placed for us, so that if that's what was done to them as a child when their brain was developing, there's such an underlying subconscious sense of shame, and they're always trying to escape that. So they can't accept any fault. And then what they do, and this is all subconscious, also project that onto others, right? So then they do those same behaviors to us, say that it's our fault, like the father saying his daughter actually made the mess. And then, okay, so there's that piece of it. The other subconscious piece going on here is that I would argue, again, not trying to victim blame, but I would argue that we played a role in accepting that, and most of accepting that behavior, and most of that is subconscious for us. So one example of it being a conscious choice is like to back down, like I just had to write something earlier this week that was recounting a lot of my abuse, and one of the examples is a scenario with washing dishes. It's like criticized how I was washing dishes, and then I changed the behavior, and then a couple weeks later that was criticized, like the gaslighting. But in that moment where I decided that I was going to change how I was washing the dishes based on his criticism, that was because I made a conscious choice. I thought it was ridiculous, his complaint, but I just took a deep breath and thought, well, I need to pick my battles, and like, I'll just deal with this if that'll get him to like shut up and stop nitpicking me about this, right? So there are conscious decisions we make to back down, to kind of make ourselves small, but so much of this is subconscious. And that has to do with our own upbringing, what we have experienced. At the very least, if you don't feel that you've experienced any kind of like abuse, emotional abuse or anything as a child, at the very least, I think that as women in America, we are cultured to have this sort of codependent mentality. And by codependent, I don't mean kind of the stereotypical idea of that word of like, you just always have to be with somebody. I don't mean that. I mean, if you're not familiar with kind of the broader definition of codependency, I suggest you go read about that online, because it has to do a lot with putting others before ourselves, like incessantly, like always serving others. We're taught as women to make ourselves small, to take care of others. We're caregivers, right? So that's taught to us from a very young age, that we put ourselves second or last, and we put others first, and we serve them, and in particular men, that's modeled for us. And so we're already kind of pre-programmed to do that. And then we, come across someone who comes across as very like, they present themselves as very charismatic, as very likable. That's how narcissists draw you in, right? And so then we are giving to them just like we're giving to other people. And then that's used against us, right? And so I think this is even more detrimental for those who have experienced emotional abuse in childhood. For some of you, I know in this program, that's been very blatant. You're aware of the abuse you experienced. For others of you, like me, like it's really just been in recent years that I've started to unpack more of what I went through as a child and recognize it as emotional trauma, because I didn't live in a blatantly abusive household. Like I knew, I wasn't close to my dad. He lived in a different state, that kind of thing. Grew up with a single mom. But now I've recognized, my mom had her own unhealed trauma, and there were some of those codependent dynamics where I felt a need to care for her emotionally, even though that wasn't real evident to others on the surface. It's not like she was depressed and passed out on the couch every night and I had to fend for myself. Not at all. She was a great mom in so many ways. But there was this subtle dynamic there. If you feel like maybe there was that kind of subtle emotionally abusive dynamic, codependent dynamic in your household growing up, and you want to learn more about that, I suggest looking up on social media, Instagram in particular, the holistic psychologist, Dr. Nicole, I forget her last name, and she wrote a book recently in the past year or two as well. but she does a great job of really providing a lot of education in manageable chunks on her posts. I always feel silly like referring people to like mental health accounts on Instagram, but that's the age we live in, right? Like I follow a lot of Instagram accounts that are very educational about trauma, mental health, mindset work, and I love that. It's a great place to live on social media versus like all of the negative stuff. But the holistic psychologist, she's on Facebook and Instagram. But she also has a free texting community. I'm a part of somebody else's texting community, but not hers, where you can get text messages of different things from her. But her Instagram posts are super educational about, because that was her story about kind of childhood trauma that she didn't recognize until she was an adult, because it didn't sound like trauma. And she was a psychologist herself before she like identified her childhood experiences as traumatic with, like I said, that kind of codependent dynamic in the family. You know, another good point here is that, you know, I always say our brains like patterns, even patterns that no longer serve us. And so patterns we learn in our family of origin, we repeat in our romantic relationships as adults. So that's another part of this subconscious kind of dynamic that's going on under the surface, where if we're used to that, where there's someone else that we're if we're taught that we care for others first and like lessen ourselves for them, it may not have been like a narcissistic person in our family, but just we were taught that we made ourselves small and we took care of them more. Then we're repeating that in relationships, and it makes us extra susceptible to an abusive narcissistic person who is subconsciously looking for that person who's going to kind of serve them and boost their ego, right? So there's that dynamic. I'm gonna look at the question again. Okay, and so where we lose our sense of self in that, I think, is partially exactly what I just said. We are like habitually over and over again putting ourselves last and putting that other person first, and then they feed off of that. So that is a gradual loss of identity. From my own story, again, something I had to write out the other day. There was this point, I think a lot of times on these calls, I haven't talked much yet for the day, so excuse me. There was a point in my marriage where I can identify a shift where I was using my voice strongly and more rooted in my identity for about the first year of the marriage. And then there was a distinct shift for me when I started to lose my sense of self. So maybe this story will resonate with you. And I encourage you to think back if you can pinpoint a time when you noticed that shift into your sense of self, your sense of identity kind of gradually starting to erode away. I love that metaphor for it. A friend of mine said that one day, and I was like, that's exactly what it is. It's eroding because it is so gradual and we don't recognize it in the moment. But looking back, I can see that, so the first year of my marriage, there was a lot more like yelling back and forth. You know, I tend to be loud with my voice when I'm angry. I tend to, you know, when I was a kid, I was a yeller and a door slammer, you know, that's who I am when I get angry. And so I did that a lot. And I would yell back at him when he would yell, and I would get frustrated by his manipulation. And I didn't know to name it as abuse, but I was frustrated by him. And so I would yell back too. And I remember talking to a friend about a year into the marriage. She'd been married longer than me. She was also actually a mental health professional. And she didn't recognize the dynamic as abusive either. And so she gave me some advice that I see now was unhelpful. But in a regular kind of marriage situation where there's not abuse, this would have been good advice. She reminded me to control what I can control. I can control my feelings and my reactions. And she said, continue to move toward him in love. No matter how he acts, you continue to do whatever you need to do to cope with your feelings and move toward him in love. What happened? And so the thought is with kind of a typical person who's not narcissistic, if you do that, that's going to soften them. They're going to see your demeanor and they're going to soften. Whereas if you're both arguing, right, you're just both going to be like bouncing off each other and stay in that argumentative defensive mode. But if you back down and aren't being defensive and you're just being open and listening and whatever, being supportive and loving, then they're going to kind of meet you there. But for a narcissist, that just gives this opening to manipulate more because you've backed down. And so that's where that very gradual erosion of my identity started to take place. And that's where I really started to do the whole walking on eggshells thing, where I was changing my behavior to meet his expectations. and just always catering to him, like every second of the day, like what can I do for him? And some of this was subconscious. And like I said earlier, with the dishwashing example, that some of it was a conscious decision, like, oh, just to, not upset him, I'll just do this. It's okay, no big deal. But even those conscious decisions, that was taking away from my sense of self, of like, even just in those little everyday things. And this is why it's so gradual and we don't notice it. Like, changing the way I wash the dishes seemed like not a big deal to me in that moment. Like, oh, I can just do this. But it was a loss of like my voice and my independence all the way down. Like, I think the fact that it's little things, almost, it makes it even worse, because it's like your very way of just maneuvering in and out of your day, like your way of moving through life, every single little thing you're having to change. That's something I'm kind of realizing it as I say it out loud. It's not something, it's not just big things they criticize, which might, again, I'm thinking out loud, big things like, let's see, like maybe they don't like your job. They criticize your job, but that feels like a calling to you and something you really love. Like, that would be more obviously a problem to you, right? Like, if you got into the relationship, into the marriage, and they knew that this was important to you, they sounded like they supported that, and now they're like, oh, your whole career path, like, I don't know, I don't support that, and they're always critical of it. Like, that's a huge red flag, because that's something big that's important to you. Now, we might still kind of back down even then, but my point is, with little things like washing the dishes, oh, like just, nitpicking, like, why are you doing that? Why don't you do this? And you're like, oh, okay, I guess I could do it your way. Like, enough of those things about just the way you live your life and who you are. I think that's, that gets more at that loss of independence and loss of sense of self, because it's like you can't even do anything for yourself. It's like they condition you, kind of turn you into this person who is dependent on them for approval, because they're going to criticize otherwise. So then you start to just go to them for approval, kind of beat them to it. Like, I'm just going to ask you permission for whatever this is, to buy a pair of jeans at Goodwill. That was part of my story too. I was hesitant to ask to spend $5 at Goodwill. And he's like, because he would criticize me spending money, or we didn't have money, I didn't make enough money, all of that. And then when I like asked for $5, then he was like, what are you talking about? Like, you can go to like the mall and buy jeans. You don't have to go to Goodwill. Like, what's the deal? And I'm like, the gaslighting again. So like, we learned to even go to them first for approval, to kind of beat them to it. So I think that's some of my thoughts on identity. And then like how narcissism compares to like other types of abuse or trauma. I'm not going to get into like trauma in general, other than kind of what I said earlier. Like, some traumas are not that relational trauma, which is abuse. Abuse is something different. It affects us in a different way, because it affects the way we relate to others. That's why childhood abuse is so horrible, because it's your developing brain as a baby and a small child. You are learning, you're hardwiring how to relate to other humans. And that's why, if the abuse is so severe that it forms this narcissistic personality, that very much is your personality. It's just that it becomes a part of who you are, to where that's very hard to heal from. Now, other personality disorders or other mental health disorders that can come as a result of childhood trauma, PTSD, all of it, very treatable. But yeah, when it comes to the level of the narcissistic personality disorder, it's hard, because it's been so hardwired. So yeah, there's a distinction there between the abuse and just other kinds of trauma, like a car accident or something, which can also cause PTSD. But I'm saying something like that wouldn't normally affect the way you just learn to relate to people, your relationship dynamics. Also, about the identity piece, I want to say that I've said this before, that narcissists tend to pick someone to be in a partnership with, to be in a romantic relationship with, who is like a good, upstanding person, someone who's attractive, someone who is well thought of by others, someone who isn't a kind of independent person, who has things going on for themselves, but then maybe underlying has some insecurities and things like that they pick up on subconsciously. Okay. And so they want to attach themselves because they care about appearances overall, right? Above all else. So they want to attach themselves to and present themselves with someone who others revere, right? Someone who others like, because that reflects on who they are. So they have such a lack of sense of self, that they're finding their identity in whoever they can like kind of latch onto. So, I mean, I think that's part of why it's even more important for us to like perform well for them, right? They have those same high expectations of themselves as they do of you. They can't meet their own expectations. They're projecting all the shame they feel about that onto you. They're putting all the pressure on you to be this person that's going to uphold their identity and their sense of who they are. And that sounds counterintuitive because they're so arrogant. But underneath, like the whole underlying kind of thing going on with the narcissist subconsciously is they have a deep sense of shame and self-loathing, and they hate who they are and can't even look at that, and they don't know who they are. So that's another piece of the identity part that I forgot to say. As far as other types of abuse, I do want to say like other abusers who maybe don't have those narcissistic traits per se, I think, first of all, I think it's underdiagnosed. And again, I'm not all about diagnoses, but it's helpful to kind of have a set of traits to put to something to kind of name it, so we understand. But I think, so I think a lot of people are abusive and maybe no one has named them as narcissistic, but that's what it is. And also, I think a lot of times abusive behavior can come out of just other emotional struggles or other struggles with mental illness, like someone who is chronically depressed. They're gonna struggle with how they relate to others and could develop some abusive behaviors. Someone who's addicted to drugs or alcohol, a lot of people are just kind of that abuse kind of comes out with rage when they're using substances. Someone who has PTSD, like they're just trying to grasp for control and don't know what's going on for themselves. And so they could lash out and develop abusive patterns towards others. Someone, bipolar disorder it's a mood disorder, also big feelings, anxiety. I said big feelings because that's how I talk about it with my daughter and with child clients. What was the other thing I was going to say? Like schizophrenia. I mean, you're hearing voices, like you could lash out and be abusive to others, right? There's one other point I was wanting to make. I can't remember. I'm not trying to say that people with these diagnoses or these emotional struggles have to become abusive. I'm just saying, I think that's kind of another kind of factor that could play into, if somebody's not really narcissistic, but they are engaging in abusive behavior, there's still something going on with them, right? Where that's coming from. So some other kind of emotional struggle. I think also, this is what I was going to say, I think also for a lot of men in particular, like in midlife, they find themselves like deep in career, deep in family life. And they can put, in our culture here in America, like put a lot of pressure on themselves to be like the provider of the family. And it's real common for men, really starting like in mid-30s, I think, to really focus so much on their career and to neglect their mental health so much that they become depressed, anxious, like so much pressure on them financially oftentimes. And so that can create a scenario. Anytime we're anxious and feel a lack of control, we want to control others around us. So I think some men in particular could become, controlling of their spouse when they're feeling that pressure to do all the things. And so they might be bossy and controlling, and that can develop into a pattern of abusive behavior with their spouse. Let's see. And as far as, so what's the connection between what comes out in our art and what we've experienced as victims of narcissistic abuse? All I want to say about that really, I think, is the back to the subconscious part of all of this, that just like many of us likely had these codependent tendencies, which again, go read about that if you're not that familiar with the full meaning of that term and how that can play out, because I never thought of myself as codependent because I was always like a loner. I wasn't just always with people, but in romantic relationships, sure enough, like with men, I became that person. So that was a hard pill for me to swallow. So even if you don't think you're codependent, go read some about that. You may identify with some of what you read that is maybe not what you've heard about it before. but so just like those dynamics are, those relational dynamics that we have are largely subconscious. The abuse is sort of, like I said, with childhood trauma, it's like subconsciously, kind of against your will, kind of programmed into you, into the depths of your brain and in your body. And so so trauma is stored in our body on the level of our emotions and our physical body, like our senses. And so the types of trauma treatments, I've talked about this before, the types of trauma treatments that are most effective are ones that engage our body, engage our senses, engage our emotions from the beginning. So in any kind of trauma work, I believe, but I know, of course, in particular about art therapy, there can be what's called a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach. A top-down is starting with like kind of your cognitive brain, like starting, I call it your thinking brain versus your feeling brain. So starting in your thinking brain and with like memories, with things that you can identify, right? And then getting down to the feelings after that. And then a bottom-up approach is starting with the feelings, starting with the senses, starting with the sensations in your body, and then working from there to connect those thoughts, to connect the thinking brain and have some meaning making out of the therapeutic experience. And so so in a lot of your all's art tasks here, we are kind of starting kind of cognitively because you have a specific directive. But if you think about, but then you are getting into your emotions with the art media and then going to the writing, which is more the cognitive. So an example I'll give of this, though, the best example of the bottom up, which is what I think is most effective use of art therapy, is like in session 1 with the scribble drawings. Like I do have you kind of start in your brain because most of us are hanging out there. Some of us tend to be more emotional. That's me on a lot of days, but for most people, we're a little more analytical, a little more in our brain. And so in our brain, in our thinking brain, right? And so I had you like name some feelings first, but if you think about just doing a spontaneous scribble drawing, just like I'm going to show you in a minute a drawing I did today. I'm going over time, but that's fine. It's fine with me. If you're starting with the expression of emotion, like that, just spontaneous, like the scribbling, just however your body feels, that anxiety in your body feels jumpy, you just draw it on the page. Then when we go back and look at it and start writing whatever is coming out of our brain, like first of all, that use of the art materials, especially fluid media, is going to bring out our emotions, like stuff is coming out of the subconscious. We're in this kind of place where it's ripe to kind of get information. So that's why it's important to just write whatever comes to your mind, whether it makes sense or not. And then you can look back on it and you're like, oh, that does make sense. Like things are coming out, or as you're writing, you're realizing, oh, this makes a lot of sense. And so that's where it's the bottom up, we're moving up to the thinking brain. And so, yeah, I don't know if that addresses the question. But so yeah, I think, I mean, I'm not quite clear on the question, and this is like such a broad topic, but yeah, I think what's coming out in the art is that stuff that's stored, locked away. It's that trauma that's stored in our subconscious brain, in our feelings, in our body, and it's coming out. And so and that's where, you know, we have to get down to that point to get to that identity that's been kind of lost or stuck at a certain point in our growth, or that's been sort of like suffocated and stuffed down, that sense of self in there. We have to get in there. It's like we have to get into the subconscious, both to get out those traumatic memories and kind of heal them, but also kind of the good stuff that's been stuck there, if that makes sense. And I think this is a good segue into what I want to talk about real quick with, not real quick, but kind of quick, with a drawing that I did just this morning. Well, before I show that, I've got a photo to show you guys, but first I want to say, so how this started. So yesterday I was doing a journaling activity from like an online kind of course I took. It was like a video bundle I purchased from like a mindset type coach. And so the basic prompt of the journaling was you're like closing your eyes and imagining kind of your perfect day, or like the most important day of your life, in the future, and you're envisioning, like it takes you through like all the different details about that and writing about it. And so I was doing that. And this is an example basically of kind of pulling out those good things about you and your identity that are there, like your desires for the future, what you really want, but it is still tucked away in the subconscious. Okay. So like I said, it's not just like kind of pulling out our trauma, it's pulling out who we really are and the good stuff, the underlying desires and things we kind of know to be true about ourselves. Like we can uproot limiting beliefs, but we can, like in the garden guided imagery, uproot those things, but we're also like, and we can plant new things in our mind, but I think we can also sort of uproot those good things about ourselves that are hiding in there. And so that's kind of what this guided journaling exercise was that I was doing yesterday. And I chose, while I was doing it, to listen to some bilateral healing music. And I may have mentioned this before, I'm not sure, but I know I mentioned at one point, brain spotting is the name of a type of trauma treatment that has some similarities to EMDR. Again, it's called brain spotting. I think it's brainspotting.com. You can go to learn about it. I'm not an expert in it. I haven't experienced it. I do have a friend who's done it as a client. I'm not acquainted with any clinicians who do it, but it was developed by a man named David Grand. And so it does this bilateral stimulation, just like with EMDR. You're either watching lights or a movement, or you have buzzers in your hands that go back and forth from right to left. And so it's stimulating both sides of your brain as you process a memory, as you access a feeling in your body or whatever. So brain spotting is founded on some similar ideas about the brain and the body. So David Grand, the creator of brain spotting, he also wrote this music. And so there's a particular, I'm looking at my phone, there's an Apple playlist that I downloaded that is his music. I don't know where else you can get it, but the name of this one, it's brain spotting : biolateral sound healing. Brain spotting, biolateral sound healing by David Grand, PhD. That's how it appears if you want to download that. There's also, when I searched for just bilateral music, there's also a lot of other playlists or whatever albums of that. A lot of them were called EMDR, bilateral stimulation music, or bilateral music. And again, similar to EMDR, it's activating both sides of your brain. So I chose to listen to this while I was doing the journaling last night. Is my point of bringing that up. And so the way it works is you have to listen to it in headphones or earbuds. If you listen to it just out in the air in the room, it's still going to be some nice relaxing music, but you're not going to have the healing, the bilateral stimulation effect. So what it does is the sound will shift in and out of right and left ear. It's not abrupt, like I kind of notice a difference, but it's not like, oh my gosh, like sound coming in and out of each ear, like I guess it's like some of the sounds change, right? It's not like one ear goes quiet and the other one has sound, but it does go back and forth. And so it's stimulating both sides of your brain. And so I chose to have this on while I was doing my journaling, and I found that it was really helpful for me. Now I tried turning it on again this morning when I was doing some more regular daily journaling I do, and I found it kind of distracting, which for me, sometimes even having instrumental music on is too distracting when I'm trying to write. And that's how it was this morning, but I was trying to like recreate what I experienced last night and I couldn't do it. But last night was really helpful for me. I do also, this is a great time to point out how, if you're making excuses that you don't have the time or the energy to do whatever healing work you want to do, but in particular, the redefined process, art tasks, I want to encourage you that it doesn't have to look perfect. So last night, I really wanted to do these journal prompts. I'd watched a video that went along with it. I finished that a day or two before. And I was like, I normally journal like in the morning and before bed, but this is like a longer thing. I wouldn't have time for it. I don't know. And then finally, like after dinner last night, my daughter was content. So she was watching a show on her laptop at the kitchen table and like drawing or playing or something. And she was okay without me right there. And so I said, hey, like, I'm going to just sit here on the couch. I could see her from where I was. The way our house is laid out, it's open. The living room's open to the kitchen. And I said, I'm going to sit here with my headphones on. I'm listening to some music while I do some journaling. And she knows that mommy journals in the morning and at night anyway. So even though she's not usually with me, but on the weekend sometimes she's there when I'm journaling, which is not ideal. So her show was really loud, like it was not ideal, but I was like, well, this is a few minutes where probably 20, 30 minutes, like she'll be content without me if she can just see me and see that I'm here. And so I sat there, I had to get up a couple times. Her show was really loud. I'm like turning up the volume on my healing music because she's watching some crazy like Netflix show. But it was still a really impactful healing time for me. So think about how you could incorporate this, how you could find time to do it, even when things seem a little less than ideal. Okay. Maybe you have to sit in your car somewhere, on a lunch break, maybe you're whatever, like it is. Let's get creative with how we can do this, and in an environment at a time that feels safe to you, of course, but yeah, you might be able to get creative about how you do it. So I was doing this journaling, and I was able to really, like, the thoughts were really flowing. I felt very much like in my, like I was accessing my subconscious, and it was about visualizing things in the future, kind of who I want to be, an important day in the future. And so, again, it's like this, I was pulling out of me good things about me, not just in the future, but like my desires and things that have always been a part of who I am, is what I'm getting at. I'm going to grab my journal real quick, because part of this is actually something I wrote today after I did some artwork. I'll show you that in a second. Well, here, I'll go ahead and bring it up. Hold on. Screen share. Okay. This is a drawing I did this morning, but in some journaling after the drawing, which I'll talk briefly about the drawing in a minute, but I wrote all of her is here now. And like, that might not make sense to you. Of course, these writings don't always make sense to other people, but I wrote that once in capital letters, and then I wrote it again with a big like space around it. Like these parts of me that I'm envisioning for who I'm becoming in the future, like I am that person now. I am the leader Jennifer now, and I have always been her. So that leader Jennifer was present in anxious, insecure 5-year-old Jennifer, just as much as 20-year-old panic attack Jennifer in college, and just as much as traumatized 32-year-old Jennifer in my marriage. 41-year-old leader Jennifer, who you guys may see as a leader, still has insecurities, but is recognizing I've always been this person. I've always wanted to use my voice and never felt like I could, never felt like my voice was valued or like it mattered. And my point in bringing this up is, like I said before, like those subconscious things, we're not just bringing up subconscious memories, we're bringing up things about who we were created to be from the beginning of time, however you feel. I think that works, from the beginning of time, from the beginning of our conception, whatever that is, our creator, our God, however you view that, I believe, has always known who we were going to be and who we're becoming, right? And so I've tapped into this deep sense of this person that I'm becoming, that I want to be like 5-10 years from now. I am her. Like, she is here now. All of her is here now. All of her is here in my body. And that is going to continue to, look different ways on the surface as I grow and change. But all of her is here now. So all of you is here now. All of Alex, all of Denise, all of Debbie, all of Adrian, of Anya, everyone here, all of Laura, like all of you is here now. It's a matter of tapping into that, of tapping into the version of you that you want to see more. And the reason why it says leader Jennifer on here is part of the visualization I wrote yesterday. It was at the very end. It was like, I don't think I wrote it down, but it was like kind of what's your name, or what do you want to call this version of you? And hint, in session 8, if you haven't gotten to it yet, you'll practice that as part of what you do in session 8 here in the Redefine process. But yeah, all of you is here now. It's a matter It's a matter of engaging in activities, whether it's therapeutic activities, the art process, just doing fun new things like we talked about, like trying new things to figure out who you are and what you like. All of those things, engaging in new relationships, testing the waters, learning to trust. In all of those spaces in your life, you are kind of finding you that has been within you all along. And so, yeah, I hope that's helpful for you. I am going to include some kind of my version of that visualization in my next program. I think I mentioned last time I'm going to be working on a follow-up program to the Redefine process that will be something live, you know, where we show up. There'll be a recording too, but like 2 hours a week for 6 weeks or something, like we're together making art. We're going to do some of that bilateral drawing, bilateral stimulation, and really focus on this idea of you that exists in you now, of kind of uncovering her. So yeah, so you'll hear more about that to come. And I'm going to message you all about directions with the app. We're going to go ahead and start kind of getting ready for that over this next week or so. So I'll message you all about that. I won't get into all the details here. All right, that's all. Thank you so much. Let me know if you have any further questions about this, what I shared. And all right, I'll see you in the group chat.